I just wasted 6+ hours of my life listening to Lindsie Chrisley's 3-part podcast series, so you don't have to. So if you don't believe a word that Todd and Julie say and you want to know her side of the story, stick around. Part 1 of the 3-part series is currently on the Southern Tea podcast, Part 2 is on the Coffee Convos podcast, and Part 3 is still currently under a paywall on Patreon. Between 2009 and 2012, the initial estrangement began. While in college, Lindsie was working for Todd's company, she was living in one of his condos, and she was driving 2 of his vehicles. However, Todd did have rules for his condo, one of which was a curfew, and he had a landline installed in the condo, and she was supposed to call every night at a certain time. Lindsie made it very clear that she was gracious to her father and everything that he did for her, but she did not want to follow by his rules, and thus she decided to move out of the condo, and she left all of the belongings that he furnished for her there. She did not take any of his stuff, and she left the 2 vehicles. Her then boyfriend, then turned husband, now ex-boyfriend, Will, was able to come help her move all of her personal belongings out. She left keys in Todd's vehicles, and Will's parents helped them get a condo, and she was able to get her own job, etc., etc. Actually, I think it was a townhouse that they got, but it doesn't matter. Lindsie and Will finish college, elope, and then she gets pregnant really quickly. While she's pregnant, her granddaddy becomes seriously ill, and he's in the ICU in Atlanta. At that time, Lindsie and Todd had not spoken since 2009 when she moved out of his condo. Now, it's important to note that this grandfather was Nanny Faye's husband, meaning Todd's own father. Todd apparently was not speaking to his parents at that time either. Lindsie doesn't know why. Lindsie felt it was important for Todd to know that his father was in the ICU, so Lindsie reaches out to her bio mother to contact Todd. Granddaddy is sick for a long time, so through this process of him being sick in the hospital, she's regularly seeing Todd during hospital visits. Now, at this point, it's 2012, and it's important to note that this is the time when Todd filed bankruptcy. Even though Todd denies it, that was the timeline. It's also important to note that before the granddaddy thing, Lindsie had received a cease and desist in February 2012 from Todd because he found out that she spoke to someone, a third party, about the fact that he had filed for bankruptcy, and he emailed her and a cease and desist email. It wasn't a legal document from an attorney. It was literally just an email from him asking her to cease and desist. Again, he claimed that there was no bankruptcy being filed in that email, but we later found out that that was untrue. So now we get to the filming of Chrisley Knows Best. So it was during this hospital time with Granddaddy that Todd brings up to Lindsie that they are filming this pilot for a possible reality show. Now, if you know anything about TV, just filming a pilot does not guarantee you a show. Lindsie also claims that she was unsure that if the show was picked up, whether or not the pilot would eventually air as season 1 or not, which is what happened. It aired as season 1. She was also initially told that the filming would begin in July of 2012. However, because Granddaddy passed at some point, it got pushed back to September 2012. Because of this, Lindsie was living at her Nanny Faye's house while she was approximately 6 months pregnant. She's living at Nanny Faye's because her and her husband were currently in the process of building a home somewhere near the Chrisley family home. Through all of the conversations that Lindsie had with producers, she feels that they built a storyline about her. It's also important to note that Todd told Lindsie she is not to wear her wedding ring, because the producers were unaware that she was already married and pregnant. This is one thing that I can say. We can put a little bit of blame on Lindsie for going along with this. However, she does say that she had no idea where this was going to go. She had no idea whether or not the pilot was going to be picked up. I do think that Lindsie very much wanted to be on the show. She very much downplayed that in what she said. That's just a little bit of my opinion. Moving on. So according to Lindsie, her and her dad had misrepresented what her life was like to producers, so they were misrepresenting her, and she walks in on a conversation that Todd and Julie, or maybe just Todd, were having with the producers, where he was telling them that she was demanding a $1 million wedding. Lindsie decides that she's done. She doesn't want to do this. She doesn't want to keep up with this, that this lie is getting too big, and she goes and starts packing her bags. At that time, she alleges that Todd told her if she packs her bags and leaves and walks out the door, she's done. This is it. Lindsay's like, okay, I'm cool, I'm done, and I don't want to do this. So she goes back to her house, or Nanny Faye's house, because she's living with Nanny Faye. So the next day, a FedEx package arrives for her, and inside the package is a letter from a high-power attorney, basically telling her that if she doesn't go back and film, she owes production $40,000. Lindsie kind of panics because she's like, $40,000 is a lot. She had no student debt from college, and neither did her husband, so this was going to be the first major debt that they had ever incurred. She does correspond back and forth with this attorney, and based on the correspondence she provided on the Patreon, I was like, I don't know why she was still scared after this, because it seemed like she was standing her ground with the attorney. She was essentially telling him, like, this letter is not addressed to me. This is not addressed to any address that I would ever live at. I don't believe that this is valid, and the back page is blank. I've never signed this. But nonetheless, she decides to go back and continue filming. They film the pilot. It's picked up. Season 1 airs, and Season 2 begins to air. However, she was a minimal cast member on most of Season 2 because, according to Lindsie, production set up a therapy session for her and her dad, to which Todd decides midway through the session that he's done. He does not want to film with her anymore. He says, this is my show. He throws his mic back down and he leaves. At some point, her and her dad reconcile again. She comes back on the show, and she's on until Season 5. Now it's 2016, and it's time for the show to renegotiate contracts. Lindsie requests payment for her son, Jackson. Production refused to pay him, but that was really a slap in the face to her because Chloe was being paid, and Chloe is literally the same age as Jackson. At this point, the family moved to Nashville to be close to Savannah in college, but Lindsie was still in Georgia. She was flying back and forth in order to film with them in Georgia, and so she finally just put her foot down with production and said, well, I'm not bringing Jackson to film anymore. He was 4 years old, he had entered preschool, and she felt like he was missing too much preschool to do this filming. She also insisted that she be given a nanny, and production agreed because they were going to save money on flights. What would happen is she would fly down to Tennessee, Jackson would stay with Will for the most part in Georgia, but when Will was working or couldn't be with Jackson, a nanny would be there. But they only agreed to that because it was the same amount of money that they were paying on first class flights. Now we're about to get into the puppy cam of it all. Also during this time, Lindsie and her husband had separated. She says that in Georgia, they do not recognize a legal separation. However, she claims that her and her husband Will had drawn up a document of separation of some sort, and she says that that was a legal document. During this separation with Will is when she dated Bachelor alum Robbie Hayes. One night, they were out having fun with friends. They go back to a friend's house, and she does say that they sleep together in the friend's house. This friend had a dog that had seizures. There was a puppy camera installed in that friend's home that would watch the dog while she was working. On that puppy cam is where the tape was recorded. Lindsie says she had no idea that there was a puppy cam recording her during this act. Now remember, this was Lindsie's friend's house. However, at some point, Lindsie and this friend become estranged. They're not really close anymore. They're not really friends anymore. In 2017, she's no longer with Robbie anymore, but she's out with a group of friends. I think she said they went to Topgolf and a bunch of other places. Everywhere they went, that puppy cam girl was following her. She said they would go to one place and then they would be like, oh my God, let's leave, let's get away from her. And then they would go to the next place and then the puppy cam girl would show up again. She said this happened multiple different times over multiple different events of her going out, and she said that it was very uncomfortable. One of those times, the girl was requesting to speak to her, and the friends were like, just go talk to her so she'll go away. Lindsie goes and talks to her, and the girl was basically like asking her to be her friend again. Lindsie felt uncomfortable. She thought it was really weird that the girl was wearing sunglasses inside a closed door building. So they left, they went to another place, and then the girl was at that place too. It was super uncomfortable. Another time she was out, she said that the girl was like rapidly calling her phone over and over, and finally Lindsie answers it, puts it on speaker so that everyone can hear, and at that point the ex-friend blackmails her with the tape. That was the first knowledge that Lindsie ever had that a tape may exist. Lindsie goes and files some kind of initial just like report saying, hey, this might be a thing, this is what I was told. At that time, she was still filming Chrisley Knows Best. She was actually at her dad's house when she filed that report. She said that she was in her dad's closet, so she had kind of confided in her dad about what was going on. He was fully aware that a tape may possibly exist. So that happens in January of 2017. Flash forward, it's now March, specifically March 6th through 10th of 2017. Lindsie is at her dad's house filming, and this particular time she does bring Jackson down to film. One of those mornings, she claims that she was at the house and it was just her, Jackson, Todd, and maybe one or two other people. She believed that Julie had left to go take Chloe to school, but there was like hardly anybody at the house, and there's a knock at the door, and it's 6 to 8 police officers, and they hand Todd some kind of package or some kind of envelope, and he takes it, and that's it. Todd says nothing to her and kind of like rolls on with his day. Lindsie says she had one day off between March 6th and 10th, and she went to the bank that day, and while she was at the bank, she saw Nanny Faye and Julie in a back room together talking to someone. She thought that was strange, but they claimed that they were adding Nanny Faye as a signer to an account. I'm running out of time, so you're gonna have to come back for part 2. Sorry. It was like 6 hours long, okay? I listened to all 6 hours of Lindsie Chrisley's 3-part podcast series talking about why she's estranged from her family. Now, if you want to go listen to all 6 hours, you can catch them over on these podcasts. The 3rd part is actually still under a paywall on Patreon. But if you ain't got time for that, let me just recap it for you. Now, this is part 2 of my recap. So if you want to watch part 1 first save this video and then click this comment and it will take you to part 1, and then you can come back and watch part 2. So at this point, it's March of 2017. She's at her dad's house to film. The cops arrived and handed Todd an envelope. He didn't say anything else. She goes to the bank. She sees Nanny Faye and Julie at the bank in a room by themselves. She thinks that's weird. She texted her husband like there's some weird stuff going on. She wants to get to the bottom of it, but she also says that she's afraid to ask her dad. She said it's normal for their family to just like sweep stuff under the rug like that. Lindsie and Will are back together at this point. However, there is a huge strain on their marriage because of her traveling to film. There's also a huge strain on her marriage because Will doesn't like Todd and Todd doesn't like Will. She's also super concerned about bringing her son back to the house to film anymore, so I think she said that was the last time she ever brought her son down to film. Now, on March 29th, 2017, there was an altercation that took place between Julie and Lindsie. Lindsie goes back down to her dad's house to film alone without her son, and an altercation took place. Lindsie has already told her side of that story so many times. The Chrisleys told their side of the story on the recent Lifetime docuseries about them. Lindsie says her side of the story is the truth. Their side of the story is a lie. I am not going to recount what her side of the story is. She has chosen to not say it again on this podcast series because she said other than that one instance, Julie has not done anything physical to her, but it was a physical altercation. And I don't want to say she was protecting Julie, but it just seemed more like out of respect, she wasn't going to keep harping on the situation. But what did happen after the situation is what's really important. Todd had requested that Lindsie just stay the night at their house that night, and Lindsie was like, no. Production was like, absolutely not. Puts her in a production van, takes her to an undisclosed hotel location, doesn't tell the rest of the family where she's at, and then immediately flies her out to go back home the next morning. And Lindsay's perspective was, okay, why would they do all that if I was the aggressor in the situation? And I believe her. Lindsie does later report this situation to the media company, but I have to get to that later because I'm going in chronological order. Soon after that, Lindsie gets a request to film a family bowling scene. Production put Lindsie and Julie on the same team for this scene. Lindsie did want to make sure that she pointed out that she doesn't believe that it was malicious. She thinks it was pre-planned that they were supposed to be on the same team. But she does say that they had additional security on hand for the event, and she said that this aired as the season finale, but it was actually filmed really soon after the Julie issue, so she wanted to point that out. On April 4th, 2017, Lindsie receives another request to film an additional scene. The scene was a celebration for Julie's cancer remission, and she said that everyone went around the table and said something nice basically about Julie, and Lindsie said nothing because she felt like anything she would say would have been fake. Lindsie did not officially report the altercation with Julie until May of 2017 because she attempted to handle it privately. Once efforts to resolve it were futile, Lindsie and Will had their attorney reach out to Maverick Television, which is the production company that produced the show, and that happened on June 10th of 2017. The reason the attorney needed to reach out and report the incident is because this incident caused not only an unsafe work environment for Lindsie, but it also was going to result in loss of income for her if she did not feel comfortable to go back and film. And she didn't feel comfortable because no one was willing to address the matter. The only possible resolution that they ever came to was that Lindsie and production agreed to film like a therapy session. Todd initially was on board with it, but when they got closer to that filming date, he backed out. Lindsie did provide stipulations to production that she didn't want anything edited out that would cause any one person to look better than another. She just wanted it filmed as is and edited as is. So I don't know if that's why Todd wanted to back out, but he ultimately backed out, and she kind of mentioned like the buck stops with Todd. It was Todd's show, so if Todd wasn't willing to do it, production wasn't going to do it without him. On June 29th, 2017, Todd and Savannah began tweeting, and in these tweets, they started referencing the puppy cam and 2 bachelors. On July 12th, 2017, someone going by the name Lauren Limpler reaches out to Lindsie's agent to request like some kind of media inquiry, wanting to book her for something. In this request, they mention hearing that a puppy cam tape might be released. And they attached a photo of Lindsie out with a celebrity. The celebrity was presumably Robbie Hayes, and Lindsie says she does remember the photo, and it was taken that night that the puppy cam friend, was following her around wearing the dark sunglasses. Also in July, Lindsie's attorney informed her that he had heard back from the media company about their requests, and unfortunately, they weren't going to be able to do anything about it. You see, everyone who was a witness that day happened to be under NDAs with Todd. So their hands were tied and nothing ever happened with that. In October 2017, Coffee Convo's podcast is in the works now. So Lindsie's attorney reaches out to Maverick Media Production to be like, hey, she's got an opportunity to appear on MTV because she was going to be able to film some scenes for Teen Mom. Yes, they did try to cause an issue with that, but she ended up filming anyways because she said that she was told that by the time what she was filming for Teen Mom would airing dates of different things, she would be out of her contract anyway, so she decided to just do it. Then Lindsie's attorney started the process of trying to get her out of her exclusivity agreement. If you don't know, on TV, you can end up being tied up in reality TV shows for way longer than you want to, because what they have the option to do is to just like send you offer letters to film for Chrisley Knows Best for like basically the entirety of Chrisley Knows Best. Let's say Chrisley Knows Best was still being filmed today and she wasn't out of her exclusivity. They could still just periodically send her requests knowing she's not going to accept them, and it could tie her up in that agreement. So naturally she wanted to get out of it. As a response, Todd's attorneys attempted to restrict her from using her last name, like Chrisley, the last name that she was given at birth. What's important to know about that is Chrisley really was her legal name even after she got married, because she changed her name to Lindsie Chrisley Campbell. Rather than like keeping her middle name, it was Chrisley Campbell. So for her not to be able to use the name Lindsie Chrisley Campbell, and this is a newer media image, but she was going by Lindsie Chrisley Campbell not only on social media at that time, but it was also on her driver's license or social security cards. There was no reason they were never going to be able to restrict her from it. By the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, Lindsie was able to go ahead and get started with her podcast with Kale. She was able to get out of that exclusivity contract and just like really live a normal life for a little bit. Things were like kind of quiet with her dad. But in 2019, all hell broke loose, because then Lindsie's former boyfriend enters the chat again. I watched almost 6 hours of Lindsie Chrisley explaining her side of the story so that you don't have to. This is part 3 of me recapping it for you. Now, this one is going to start off with the text between Bachelor Robbie Hayes and her brother Chase. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, you probably need to save this video, go watch the first 2 parts, and come back. So between April 9th, 2019 and May 20th, 2019, Lindsie's brother Chase is texting with Bachelor Robbie Hayes. As a reminder, when Lindsie was separated from her husband, she briefly dated Robbie Hayes. And Robbie Hayes is the guy that's in the puppy cam tape with Lindsie. If you don't know what I'm talking about with the puppy cam tape, you definitely have to go watch the first 2 parts and come back. So the text messages between Robbie and Chase start off with Chase reaching out to Robbie for a business venture. And Robbie's like, yeah, man, what's up? And Chase is like, well, I can't talk about it over text. And he's like, okay. So they play this like phone tag banter back and forth for a little bit. And eventually they're able to meet up over a FaceTime call. Let me back up just a little bit. During that text banter, there is one little snippet where Chase says, got nudes or something of that nature to Robbie, and Robbie seemingly ignores that text from Chase, and then Chase texts him again later, and then they text again, and then yes, they meet up for a FaceTime call. It was not until August 21st, 2019 that Robbie sent an affidavit to Lindsie's attorney which explained what happened on that FaceTime call. The reason that affidavit was ever even sent is because Robbie reached out to Lindsie at some point in time to be like, hey, I just want to let you know that like your brother has been messaging me and this is the contents of the message. Rather than Lindsie getting the screenshots directly from Robbie, she asked him to send them directly to her attorney. So she had not seen the messages at that point, because Lindsie's life was crazy. Her family was tweeting about her. Everyone was talking about the possible existence of this puppy cam tape. So to protect her mental health, she asked her attorney to kind of like be the go-between on this one. Her attorney immediately sent over the messages to, I believe, the U.S. Attorney's Office, or he sent it to the feds basically. So not only did Robbie provide screenshots of those messages, and they are on the Patreon if you want to see them, he also explains what happened on that FaceTime call in the affidavit to her attorney. Robbie claims that Chase was requesting to purchase nudes of Lindsie. He starts off with a certain number and eventually ends on $15,000. Chase, Lindsie's brother, was willing to pay Robbie $15,000 for nude photos of his sister. One can only assume the reason that he was making such a request was to have them leaked, which to me is quite disgusting. Robbie also told Lindsie's attorney that he believed Chase had purchased the puppy cam tape based on the FaceTime call. Let me back up just a little bit. In early June of 2019, Nanny Faye and Lindsie's brother Kyle requested that they meet up with her at a Dunkin' Donuts. Now, at this point, Lindsie had not spoken to Kyle or Nanny Faye or really anybody in the family for a long time, so she had presumed that the reason for them wanting to meet with her was that her father wanted to get in contact with her and potentially apologize, because remember, he was tweeting some nasty shit about her at this point. At this meeting with Kyle and Nanny Faye, Lindsie learns that Todd had received his pre-indictment letter. Nanny Faye asked if she was willing to talk to Todd, and Lindsie ultimately agrees to do so. Now this part's kind of sad. So they meet up at some restaurant in Tennessee. Remember, Todd had made this request, not Lindsie. She sees him and immediately goes to hug him, and rather than hug her back, he says, "Lift up your shirt and let me prove that you're not wearing a wire." Of course, she did that because she was like, well, it wasn't my intention to hurt him. I'm not even the one that requested that meeting. So she does that, proves she's not wearing a wire. Then he says, leave your phone in your car and let's go inside. So she was happy to do that because she was like, again, I wasn't there to like do anything. I wasn't intending on recording anything. So she left her phone in the car. They sit down, they have small talk for just a minute, like how's Jackson, how's Chloe, etc., etc. He abruptly ends the small talk and lets her know that he had received the pre-indictment letter. He says it's not true, whatever. And he goes into, according to Lindsie, he goes into a story that seemed to her like he was telling her a story that she would need to then go with. So Todd basically presents this fabricated narrative that Lindsie had met with Josh Waits of the Department of Revenue multiple times and was having an affair with him. And Lindsie denied that. She was like, that's not true. I've never even met him. She, at that point, didn't even know what he looked. And then Todd's like, no. And then he repeats the story again. And Lindsie's like, no. So clearly that didn't go well. So she goes back home to her husband and tells him what happened. And he's like, I think you need to file a report about this. You need to make sure that someone knows in case this gets out at some point. So Lindsie tells her attorney, and her attorney file like an informational report about what happened. Now that all happened in early June of 2019. By the end of June, Todd was texting Lindsie and basically threatening her about the puppy tape. In July 2019, Lindsie files a report with the sheriff's office about the fact that Todd had been threatening her with the puppy tape. The sheriff advised Lindsie that she needed to contact the FBI, but that the FBI, often doesn't really take these things that seriously, and that she may never hear back from them. The next day after she filed that report with the FBI, she gets a phone call from someone with the FBI. It is Lindsie's belief that since her father had a pending indictment at that time, they linked these two things together, and that was who called her. She said she was unaware at the time that the person who called her with the FBI was someone who was working on his tax evasion case. She now knows that they were someone that was working on that. Lindsie claims that the conversation she had over the phone with the FBI agent had nothing to do with her father's tax case. They requested that she have an in-person meeting with them and requested that she bring evidence related to the puppy tape situation. It was at the in-person meeting that the FBI agent asked her if she knew anything about the tax situation. Lindsie said nope, she knew nothing, and that was that. That was the only thing said about it. So yes, the family is correct in that Lindsie did talk to the FBI, but it wasn't about the tax. It was about the puppy cam. Around August or September of 2019, that was when the federal indictment came down on Todd and Julie. There was a warrant put out for their arrest. They turned themselves in and were released out on bond. So pre-indictment, early June, actual indictment, like August or September. Because of all of her dad's allegations, in September 2019, Lindsie did release her statement stating that she had nothing to do with this. In fact, that was around the time that she had done the Dr. Phil thing. In November 2020, Lindsie finds out that her dad was having her followed. She also finds out at that time that her dad and her family were planning to expose her on a podcast. So then in December 2020, she reaches out to the FBI via email and lets them know about the following thing and lets them know about this exposure, or well, the plans that they had claimed that they were going to expose her. So the FBI agent reaches back out to Lindsie and says that it's a violation of his parole. Remember, he's out on bond, and advises her to reach out to his parole officer, and she does that. She never got any follow-up from the officer or anything, but she's unaware if it's normal to or not to. She just knows that she never. Now, this is really important. In December 2020, TMZ publishes her police report regarding the puppy cam. Lindsie believes that that leak could have only come from the people who are aware that she ever filed a report about the puppy cam, which would be her and the people involved in the report. So she believes it was either Todd, Chase, or the puppy cam owner. Now, this is just my opinion, but based on the affidavit that Robbie Hayes filed, he said that he believed that Chase purchased the puppy cam because Chase told him he did. So, to me, I don't think it was the puppy cam owner. I think it was Chase or Todd. Also, in those threatening texts I mentioned that caused Lindsie to reach out to the FBI in the first place, Todd told her that Chase bought it for $5,000 from the puppy tape girl. So two people are corroborating the same story now. Of course, Todd is still denying that he ever said that to Lindsie, but whatever. Now, from 2019 to 2022, Lindsie continues on with her other business ventures and the Coffee Convo podcast. She stays really distant from the Chrisley family brand. During that same time, Julie and Todd's legal troubles kept getting worse. They lose their trial and eventually are put in prison. Now, if you recall, at some point she briefly rekindles with her family and has them on a podcast series. Now, I'm going to have to come back for a part 4, and I'll get into this later, but she does later say that she thinks that Savannah used her to, launch her podcast. Lindsie does state that she did speak to Todd 3 different times while he was in prison. The last time she spoke to him was in March of 2023. They were released, and she gave him time to consider if he wanted to reach out to her or not. He never did. And then, of course, they start talking about her. And then more recently, they do the Lifetime thing, which sparked her to do this 3-part podcast and tell her story. Now, on July 8th, 2025, she communicates with Nanny Faye. And I'll get into that on part 4. You rang. I listened to several hours of a 3-part podcast series of Lindsie Chrisley explaining as to why she is estranged from her family from her perspective so that you don't have to. This is actually part 4 of the series. If you're interested in starting from the beginning, go ahead and save this video first so you don't lose me, and then click at the bottom down here. There should be a little bar. You can click that and then start with episode 1, and now this is episode 4. Okay, let's get started. As always, remember, I'm ethical. I like to reference my sources, so part 1 of this podcast series is on Southern Tea. Part 2 is Coffee Convos, and part 3 is also on Southern Tea. Now, it was under a paywall, but it has now been released for free. If you want to see this in video form and you want to see the receipts that Lindsie came with, you still have to pay for those on Patreon. Okay, let's get into it. Now, I understand that on part 3, I ended with 2023, but I'm going to back up just slightly to 2021 again to explain a couple of things. So in 2021 is when Lindsie and Will are starting to get divorced. This part wasn't exactly in the podcast series, but I just remember from my recollection, it was around summer, maybe July, when they announced that they were getting divorced. And I think it went on until the fall of that year. But again, that's just because I used to be an avid listener to all of Kale's podcasts. I've since slacked off a little bit, but I digress. So it's really important for me to talk about 2021 because at that time, Lindsie and Todd were actually starting to work on a reconciliation, but privately. So Lindsie states on the 3-part series that her and her dad began communicating in 2021. This was all privately, and if you remember the media at that time, people were starting to speculate some stuff too. But at some point, Todd had invited her and Will down to Palm Springs. I guess they had like a house that they either owned or were renting in Palm Springs. So Todd had invited them down there, and they had all planned on going to Universal together. And Lindsay's like, we're gonna have to go ahead and just like talk about maybe coming public with our reconciliation at this point, because I just don't want somebody to like photograph us and take that moment from us, essentially. I guess the Chrisley show is also under like the Universal belt. So she was just concerned that someone would notice that they were all together, whatever. Anyways, now that was very important information for me to hear. So I want to really emphasize that for any of you skeptics who also follow Kale and her podcasts, because that information wasn't revealed until part 3, which is on the Southern Tea. And I was personally very fucking confused as to why Lindsie kept saying the things she was saying, but proceeded to have this whole reconciliation podcast. It was like a 4-part podcast, Chrisley family reunion thing back in the day. It was like 2021, 2022. Well, lucky for me and for you, she explains how that came to be. It was because she was visiting Todd and her family at Palm Springs. So they didn't want it to just get outed on their own. They wanted to kind of control that narrative. So they decided to do this podcast crossover series. They were on Coffee Combos, the Chrisley Knows Best podcast, maybe Barely Famous. I think one of Kale's other podcasts. And then a 4th was Savannah's new podcast that she was launching. That's going to be important. So keep that in the back of your mind. And that was the last part of the 4-part series. So Todd and Lindsie are having all of these conversations about possibly doing like a podcast thing and just like reconciling their relationship that way publicly. According to Lindsie, at some point in these conversations, Todd reveals that Savannah had been wanting to start a podcast of her own. Lindsie agrees to include her in that podcast series, and that's how she launched her podcast. I think like episode 1, maybe not episode 1, but it was very early on, was this Lindsie Chrisley, Savannah Chrisley crossover event. Kale noted something that I think is really important to understand. Crossovers are the best way to build a podcast audience or to grow a podcast audience that's already built. So for Savannah to have started her podcast off with this, it was like giving her a silver spoon. A good bulk of her initial audience came from this podcast crossover, both from Coffee Combos and of course from Chrisley Knows Best as well. Lindsie also noted in the conversation that Coffee Combos was actually the least benefited podcast. Like I guess all the other podcasts got more engagement or follows, whatever, than Coffee Combos. And Savannah benefited the most because it was a brand new podcast and she was establishing an audience. So this all takes place between 2021 and 2022. Despite this reconciliation with her family, Lindsie states that her and Savannah still were at arm's length. Their relationship was still slightly strained, but she still did want to help Savannah because that's her sister. Most of the last episode of the 3-part series that Lindsie did, she's kind of talking a lot about her feelings and emotions and also clarifying timeline specifics. One of which I think is really important for you guys to understand. On the Family Lifetime special and on other media outlets, Todd keeps talking about how the last straw that broke the camel's back, what have you, is this letter that Lindsie sent to the FBI. I talked about that letter on other parts of my series. Again, if you have not watched those, click down here, go watch those and come back. But don't forget to save this so you don't get lost. So yes, Lindsie wrote an FBI letter. And yes, that letter was read at Todd's sentencing. Lindsie made it very clear that she did not agree necessarily with that letter being read, but there was nothing she could do about it. We also got to hear Lindsie read out loud that letter if you're listening to the podcast and physically see it if you are under the paywall. That letter was in no way, shape, or form her trying to throw her family under the bus. It was her asking for, in my view, it was just her asking for protection for herself. But again, go to like the first initial parts of my series and you can find out about that too. So Todd claims that once that letter was read in his sentencing, that a bridge had been officially burned in his relationship with Lindsie. In recent years, he has insinuated multiple times that that is the last contact that he has had with his daughter, Lindsie. But Lindsie's records show otherwise. For example, in late 2022, Lindsie and her family are still under conversations with each other, according to her. That is going to be his last Christmas that year before he goes to prison, and she texts Todd about visiting for Christmas with her son. Todd replies to her that his children don't stay in hotels when he has a home. Basically, in my view, insinuating, no, you're not staying in a hotel because Lindsie said she was going to stay in a hotel with Jackson. He's saying, no, you're going to stay at my home. Those texts took place a few weeks before Christmas. Todd's indictment hearing took place around Thanksgiving time. And the indictment hearing is when the FBI letter was read. And if that's not enough evidence to prove to you that they had spoken, in January 2023, Lindsie sends Todd and Julie religious books and Bibles to their prisons. Lindsie admits that Julie's communication was really weird. Also, Julie was at a prison in Kentucky and I'm in Kentucky, and I can assure you that that prison probably is a piece of shit. But the communication between Julie in prison was like wishy-washy, Lindsie says, but she did try to reach out, and allegedly, according to Nanny Faye, Julie was trying to reach out back to Lindsie, but they were unable to like link a lot of times because there were a lot of phone issues, and she had issues like setting up her communication in general, just initially. Also in 2023, Todd emails Lindsie from prison asking her to contact his podcast network to help continue Chrisley Confessions while he's incarcerated. Lindsie does contact them. She sets up a meeting, and unfortunately, all of their communications came to a halt after Savannah then slapped the podcast network with her power of attorney information that she had. And so Lindsie says at that point, she had no more communications with the podcast network. And if you're not understanding what's happening, Todd's wanting to continue his income, and Lindsie was willing to help with that and continuing on with that podcast. Whether it be like family members rotating in and out and filming, whatever, she was going to be far more than willing to assist with this. Lindsie claims that Todd had sent roughly 50 different text messages while he was in prison up until March of 2023 when all of their contact finally came to an end. And if you want to know what the straw was that broke the camel's back, you're going to have to come for part 5. And I'm really sorry to have to do that. I was hoping not to. Also, for those that are asking, yes, I am going to give my official opinions on this once I complete the series. So stay tuned. Make sure to follow me if you're not following me already. See you later. I listened to multiple hours of Lindsie and Kale explaining Lindsie's side of the story so that you don't have to. This is part 5 and the final part of my recap. As a reminder, if you want to go listen to this yourself, you can listen to part 1 on Southern Tea, part 2 on Coffee Convos, and part 3 also on Southern Tea. However, if you're a person, and I've had several in my comments say that they want to see the receipts, you need to go watch that on Patreon. So it's behind a paywall, but she does provide the receipts. I do want to start off by backing up to like 2008 or something like that. Yes, Julie does adopt Lindsie. I think I left that off of the recap. It probably should have been on part 1. Oh, by the way, if you haven't watched all of the parts, click down here and you can go start from the beginning and then come to this part. This is the final part. So Julie does adopt Lindsie. Lindsie asked to be adopted, and that is pretty much all Lindsie leaves into that story. She says that it happened when she was 19. Now, I do know via the podcast episode that Julie and Todd recently released that they are claiming, I think Todd said that he thought she was 18. It doesn't really matter. Either way, she was a grown adult when it happened. Julie has stated that she told Lindsie she would be happy to adopt her, but she wanted Lindsie to have conversations with her biological parents, meaning Todd and her biological mother first. And both Lindsie and Julie have confirmed that the adoption did take place. So that's pretty much all I got to say about that. Moving on to part 5. So what Todd is claiming is that the letter that Lindsie wrote to the FBI is the reason that he was thrown into prison. This stems because, yes, that FBI letter was read at his sentencing. However, if you've been keeping up with all of these parts, you know that that FBI letter is not actually what it seems. The FBI letter was written after Lindsie found out that Todd was following her and after Todd threatened her with the puppy cam tape. At this point in time, Robbie Hayes had already told her about what was going on with her brother, and that her brother had told Robbie that he had purchased the puppy cam tape. And then Todd himself admits to the puppy cam tape being in their possession. He said that it was on a hard drive. So Lindsie writes this letter to the FBI out of concern for her own personal safety. This letter was, yes, then read at his sentencing. Lindsie states that she disagrees that that letter was read at the sentencing. I gather that Lindsie disagrees with letters like that being used to show somebody's character. Me personally, I do disagree. I think that when you're talking about sentencing, that does kind of depict Todd's personality, that he would be willing to do something like this to his own daughter. And he was going on and on about the smear campaign about how his daughter was working with Josh Waits, and that was untrue. So I do think that the letter was relevant, just me personally. So it's 2023, and Todd calls into a podcast from prison, and he at that time states that the bridge has been absolutely burned between him and Lindsie because of this FBI letter, and alleges that she's the reason he's in prison. Now, this is where if you haven't watched at least the last part, you need to go watch that and come back. So in March of 2023, Lindsie had booked Nanny Faye to come on to the Southern Tea podcast. Lindsie explicitly states on her side of the story that Nanny Faye actually really enjoyed coming onto the podcast. She got to drive down to Atlanta, she got to see other family members, and she got a little bit of extra spending money to do it. And she said that Nanny really enjoyed chatting it up with Lindsie on the podcast. Savannah tries to prevent Nanny Faye from going onto the podcast. She claims that she needs childcare for that weekend. Lindsie says that she offered for Chloe to stay at her house for the whole weekend to make things easy and for childcare not to be an issue. At some point from prison, Todd emails Lindsie and is like, yeah, Nanny Faye's too tired, she can't do it. And Lindsay's like, well, if that's the case, then why around that time did Savannah put Nanny Faye and Chloe on a plane to go to Pensacola, Florida? Clearly, if Nanny's too tired to drive to Atlanta, she's far too tired to watch Chloe and then also put Chloe on a plane with her and do that much traveling. And this is where Lindsie kind of goes into debunking that Savannah did this all by herself, because she didn't. She apparently had a lot of help from Nanny Faye. Lindsie goes on to say, well, there's just no way that Savannah was able to do special forces and whatever. She listed all the different projects that Savannah did. She did all her political stuff with Donald Trump. She did so much stuff during that period of time that there's just truly no way that she was able to do that and not have a babysitter and not have help. And Lindsie claims that that help was from Nanny Faye. So this dispute leads to Lindsay's final communication with her father directly. And this happened on March 13th of 2023, where she sent a response email to Todd's email, basically covering for Savannah and saying that Nanny Faye was too tired. And Lindsay's like, that's funny because blah, 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 and goes on to explain her side of the story. And she's like, I'm just going to go ahead and book Nanny Faye via Zoom. And that was March 13th. But on March 30th, a producer named Emily Liebert contacts Lindsie about a new show featuring all of Todd's children. While he's in prison, it was going to be pitched as an idea of just what the kids are up to while he's in prison. Lindsie informs Savannah about this email that she had gotten. Savannah does tell Todd about this. So Todd is made aware. I think Lindsie also spoke to Chase about this. Everybody was aware of it, but Lindsie never had direct communication with her father after March 13th. Savannah instructs Lindsie to send the email to Lee White at some agency. I don't know. I guess somebody that's handling stuff for Todd. I don't know. Lindsie says that she was led on to believe by both Chase and Savannah that this was a project they were interested in. So she goes ahead and sends the email. She then gets emails back from this Emily Liebert person saying, this is a pass from Chase, and there's other projects that Savannah and Chase are working on. And apparently Savannah's agent told this Emily Liebert person that Savannah and Lindsie hadn't spoken in 2 years, which obviously wasn't true. So Lindsie was super confused, and she sent a text to Savannah and Chase saying the treachery is real or something to that effect. They get kind of into a fight, but it felt like Chase was being the biggest aggressor in that text conversation. Lindsie felt like Savannah kind of stood up for her a little bit, but she said it was still really weird. And it just kind of felt like they led her on, and she was like, well, I would have never even sent that message on to Lee White if you told me you were uninterested in this project. She also said that Todd had instructed her that the kids should all be working together while he's away. So she felt like she was respecting her father's wishes, despite the fact that she had recently gotten into an argument with him on March 13th, about 2 weeks before. So at that point, Lindsie's called them dishonest, and that was like the last conversation she had with them, March 30th. In April of 2024, Lindsie states on the Southern T that she will not be attending her parents' appeal. If you were following the Chrisley thing, there was an appeal that was denied. In response to that, Savannah gets onto her Instagram stories and starts talking shit about Lindsie. She says that Todd and Julie didn't even want Lindsie there. They did not invite her, and she cites, once again, the FBI letter. Well, that's funny because anybody can attend a public appeal. So if Lindsie really wanted to go, she could. And Lindsie didn't say that on her Southern Tea podcast. She was just stating that she would not be attending. She didn't go too heavily into it. Now, in May of 2025 is when Todd and Lindsie get their presidential pardon. As you can tell, I'm very excited about that. In June of 2025, Savannah comments on someone else's TikTok, and this was just a written comment. It was not a video comment or anything. It was a written comment, and she comments that Lindsie put her parents in prison, and that's just me paraphrasing. And she also tagged Lindsie in that comment. Apparently, Lindsie did not see that. It was something that came out when they were doing the research for this 3-part series. So that was early June. Then on June 20th, 2025 is when the Fox News interview came out. So if you watch the Fox News interview, it was absolute BS. But Todd says a lot of crazy shit on that Fox News thing. They're high and mighty right now because they've gotten this wonderful pardon because their daughter has worked so hard to kiss Donald Trump's ass. Oh, did I say that out loud? But at the end of that interview, Todd states that he doesn't have any grandchildren and that he can't wait to have some someday. Well, Todd does have grandchildren. He has Jackson. Yes, Chloe's a grandchild, but he considers Chloe his child. But he has Jackson, Lindsie's son. So he's omitting his actual grandson, who he has called his grandson before. Lindsie does state to Kale that Jackson found out about this and he was really upset and he didn't understand why his grandpa would do that. She also said Jackson was trying to text Todd from prison and didn't understand why Todd couldn't text him back because he's a little kid and he didn't get that you don't have a cell phone in prison. On July 1st, 2025, Chase says that Lindsie is responsible for their parents being in prison. On July 8th, 2025 is the last time that Lindsie contacted Nanny Faye. This contact was to initiate contact with her father. She felt she shouldn't just call him out cold, but she wanted Nanny Faye to tell him that she would like to speak to him. Nanny Faye did respond to her and said that she did tell Todd that Lindsie was interested in speaking. And then on September 9th is when the god-awful Lifetime documentary aired. So that basically brings us to the end of Lindsie's timeline, and if you want to come back, I will give you my thoughts on everything and maybe even watch the stupid documentary from Lifetime.